Mom, look. His ring looks just like yours. Sophie's excited voice cut through the quiet hum of the museum gallery. Emily froze mid-step, her pulse quickening. She turned to see Sophie pointing at a tall, impeccably dressed man with salt and pepper hair. His piercing eyes locked onto hers, narrowing slightly. The man glanced down at the emerald-encrusted ring on his hand, then back at Emily, who instinctively hid her own hand behind her back. The air between them felt suddenly charged, as if the museum walls were closing in. "I'm sorry," Emily stammered, pulling Sophie's hand. "She's mistaken. Let's go, sweetheart." But the man didn't move aside. "Interesting," he said, his voice smooth yet firm. "A ring like this? It's not exactly common." Emily forced a smile, trying to appear unfazed. "It's just costume jewelry. A family piece." His eyes studied her, uncomfortably intent. "Family, you say? Where might they be from?" Emily tightened her grip on Sophie's hand. "Excuse us," she said curtly, pulling Sophie away and heading for the exit. Her heart raced as she tried to shake the unsettling encounter. She wasn't sure who he was, but the way he had looked at her, at the ring, made her stomach churn. When they finally stepped onto the bustling street outside, Emily took a deep breath. "Sophie, you can't point at strangers like that, especially rich ones. They don't like being bothered." "But Mom," Sophie protested, "it's exactly the same. Grandma's ring even has the little gold lines on the sides." "Enough, Sophie," Emily snapped, regretting the sharpness in her tone almost instantly. "Let's just get back to the hotel." Unbeknownst to Emily, the man in the gallery had followed them. From a distance, Alessandro Di Martino watched as the pair disappeared into the crowd. His jaw tightened. That ring wasn't just any family piece. It was part of a unique set commissioned by his grandmother decades ago, one of which had been missing for over 30 years. How could a stranger, an ordinary woman from Boston, possibly own its twin? Alessandro pulled out his phone. "Paolo," he said when his assistant answered. "Find out everything you can about a woman named Emily Miller from Boston. She has a daughter, Sophie. I want a full report by tomorrow." Emily tried to shake the encounter, but the man's penetrating gaze lingered in her mind long after they'd returned to the hotel. She examined the emerald ring on her finger, a piece her late mother had always worn, claiming it was a gift from a family friend. It had always seemed like a relic from another life, far removed from their modest reality. "Mom, are you mad at me?" Sophie asked from the bed, her small voice cutting through Emily's thoughts. "No, honey. I'm sorry," I snapped. "You didn't do anything wrong." She forced a smile. "Let's order room service and pick a movie, okay?" But as they settled in for the night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter in the museum was far from over. What she didn't know was that across town, Alessandra was piecing together fragments of her life and uncovering a past she never knew existed. The next morning, Emily awoke to the sound of Sophie rummaging through her backpack. Sunlight streamed through the thin hotel curtains, signaling the start of their second day in New York. Emily had barely slept, her mind replaying the scene at the museum. She told herself it was a chance encounter, nothing more. Yet a gnawing unease remained. "Mom, can we go back to the museum today?" Sophie asked, holding up a postcard she'd purchased from the gift shop. "I didn't get to see everything." Emily hesitated. Returning felt like tempting fate, but she didn't want to disappoint her daughter. "Maybe later," she said. "Let's check out Central Park first." By the time they reached the park, the crisp morning air had helped Emily relax. Sophie darted ahead, chasing pigeons near a fountain, her laughter carrying over the crowd. For a moment, Emily felt at ease, until she caught sight of him. Alessandro Di Martino stood near a vendor cart, dressed casually in a tailored jacket and dark jeans. His piercing eyes locked onto hers the instant she saw him, and this time, there was no mistaking his intention. He wasn't just passing by. Emily's pulse quickened as he approached, weaving through the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Ms. Miller," he greeted smoothly, his accent faint but unmistakable. "What a coincidence." "Is it?" Emily asked, her voice sharper than intended. She stepped protectively closer to Sophie, who had stopped to look up at the stranger. Alessandro ignored the tension in her tone. I apologize if I startled you yesterday, but that ring, it's remarkable. I'd like to know more about it. It's a family heirloom, Emily said stiffly. That's all there is to know. I find that hard to believe, Alessandro replied, his tone calm but probing. You see, that ring is part of a set that belonged to my grandmother. One of the pieces went missing decades ago. Emily's stomach dropped. I don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly. If you'll excuse us, we have somewhere to be. Alessandro stepped aside but didn't let the conversation end. I could help you, he said, his voice low. There's a story behind that ring, and I think it connects our families in ways you might not realize. Emily froze mid-step, his words sending a chill down her spine. I don't need your help, she said, turning away. But Alessandro wasn't deterred. Think about it, he called after her. If you change your mind, here's my card. He extended it to her, but she ignored it, grabbing Sophie's hand and disappearing into the crowd. Back at the hotel, Emily paced the room, the business card sitting untouched on the desk. Who was Alessandro Di Martino to make such claims? And what did he mean about their families being connected? She glanced at the ring on her finger, its emerald catching the light. Could it really belong to his family? And if so, how had her mother come to own it? Sophie watched her mother with a puzzled expression. Mom, are we going back to Boston tomorrow? Yes, Emily replied, though her voice lacked conviction. She hated how unsettled she felt, like her life was suddenly part of a story she didn't understand. But deep down, she knew Alessandro was right about one thing. There was more to that ring than she had ever imagined. The train ride back to Boston was meant to be uneventful, a way for Emily to leave the unsettling memories of New York behind. But as she stared out the window, clutching Sophie's backpack on her lap, Alessandro's words echoed in her mind. There's a story behind that ring, and I think it connects our families. Mom, you've been quiet, Sophie said, leaning against her arm. Are you okay? I'm fine, Emily replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. She glanced down at her hand, where the emerald ring seemed to gleam brighter than usual. It felt heavier somehow, as if the weight of its history had suddenly become real. Back in their modest Boston apartment, Emily finally exhaled. The familiar surroundings gave her a fleeting sense of comfort, but her curiosity had taken root. She couldn't ignore Alessandro's claims, no matter how much she wanted to dismiss him. The next day, after dropping Sophie at school, Emily retrieved an old shoebox from her closet. It contained the few keepsakes she had of her late mother, a stack of letters, a faded photograph, and a small velvet pouch that once held the ring. She hadn't opened the box in years, hesitant to confront the past. But now, she needed answers. Emily spread the contents across her kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the letters. Most were mundane, written to friends or family, but one stood out, a letter addressed to her mother, postmarked from Florence, Italy. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, and deliberate. Cara Elena, the letter began. Emily's breath caught. Her mother's name wasn't Elena, it was Margaret. Yet the letter spoke of someone named Elena fleeing from danger and leaving behind something valuable. The words were cryptic, but they hinted at a love story shrouded in secrecy. At the bottom was a name she didn't recognize, Luca Di Martino. Her heart pounded as the pieces began to click into place. Alessandro hadn't been mistaken. This ring, her mother's most prized possession, was part of a much larger story, one her mother had kept hidden. That evening, Emily found herself staring at Alessandro's business card. Against her better judgment, she dialed the number. The line rang twice before his smooth, accented voice answered. Emily Miller. I had a feeling you'd call. I'm not sure why I'm doing this, she began, her voice tense. But I found a letter. It mentioned someone named Luca Di Martino. Does that name mean anything to you? There was a pause, then Alessandro spoke carefully. Luca is my uncle. He passed away years ago. Why do you ask? Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The letter was addressed to someone named Elena. My mother. She wasn't Elena. But this connection doesn't feel random. Can we meet? Somewhere public. Of course, Alessandro agreed without hesitation. I'll come to Boston. No, Emily's tone was firm. I'll decide when and where. As you wish, Alessandro replied, his voice carrying a faint note of satisfaction. But you're making the right choice. Emily hung up, her nerves frayed. She wasn't sure if this was the right choice, or a mistake she couldn't undo. But one thing was certain. She couldn't keep running from the truth. Emily chose a small coffee shop near her neighborhood. The location felt neutral enough, public, yet not so crowded that they couldn't speak without attracting attention. She arrived early, taking a seat in the corner and resting her trembling hands on the table. Every passing minute felt like a test of her resolve. Part of her wanted to leave before Alessandro showed up, but the letter referencing Luca Di Martino wouldn't let her rest. When he finally entered, she noticed how he moved with quiet assurance, scanning the room until he spotted her. There was no dramatic greeting. He simply sat down, rested his palms on the table, and studied her face. "Thank you for meeting me," Alessandro began, his tone polite but expectant. Emily nodded, fighting an urge to pull the ring off her finger and hide it in her bag. "I won't waste time. My mother's name was Margaret, not Elena. She died when I was in high school, and she never mentioned any link to Italy. I found a letter addressed to someone named Elena. The author was Luca Di Martino. Your uncle." Alessandro's jaw tightened. "My uncle passed away before I was born. Still, his involvement suggests a serious matter. My grandmother once mentioned a man named Luca who'd left Italy under difficult circumstances, but no one in our family speaks openly about it." Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. That letter hinted at a dangerous situation. It mentioned someone fleeing, carrying something precious. "I don't know if my mother was Elena or if she inherited the ring from someone else, but I can't ignore the fact that your family name is on that letter, and the ring on my finger seems to be part of a matching set. Do you have any records of who might have left Italy with it?" Alessandro shook his head. "Our family archives are patchy. After the war, many documents disappeared. But my grandmother once said the Di Martino collection included several unique emerald pieces, each bearing a distinctive engraving. If your ring is truly one of those pieces, it would confirm a link to my family's lost heirlooms." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully set a worn photograph on the table. Emily noticed an older woman seated beside a younger man who resembled Alessandro slightly. "That's my grandmother, Viola Di Martino, with her son Luca. She rarely let people take pictures. This is one of the few I have." Studying the photograph, Emily felt a strange pang. Something in the woman's eyes reminded her of her mother's determined gaze. "Why did Luca leave Italy?" she asked softly. Alessandro leaned back, exhaling. "Family rumors claim he had a secret relationship that enraged his father. Luca vanished, and no one heard from him again until a brief letter arrived, saying he'd settled in the United States. Then everything went silent." Emily felt her breath hitch. "My mother once mentioned a friend from overseas, someone she described as a noble traveler. She never gave details, and I always thought she was just romanticizing. Could that have been Luca?" "It's possible," Alessandro admitted. "If your mother was connected to Luca, that would explain how the ring ended up in your family. Luca might have left it with her, or perhaps she inherited it from someone else close to him. The question is, where do we go from here?" Emily fidgeted with her coffee cup. "I don't know. This letter is the only real lead I have. It's in Italian, and I've translated pieces of it, but I need a clearer picture. It references someone named Elena crossing borders." His gaze narrowed. "Have you considered that Margaret and Elena might be the same person? People did change names, especially after the war, to protect themselves. If Luca and Margaret had a child," he paused, letting the implication speak for itself. Emily's grip on the cup tightened. "You're suggesting my mother was hiding her identity all these years? That would mean I'm directly tied to your family." Alessandro searched her face. "I'm not jumping to conclusions, but we can't ignore the possibility. My grandmother used to say that a scandal forced Luca to flee. Maybe your mother was at the center of that. Or maybe she helped him escape and assumed a new identity." Emily's heart pounded. "I want the truth. For my daughter, I need to know where we come from. But I don't want Sophie dragged into something messy or dangerous. Let me talk to a few relatives in Italy," Alessandro offered. "Some old documents might still exist in our estate records." I can reach out discreetly and see if anything references Elena, Margaret, or even a hidden relationship. But it would help if you shared the letter. Emily tensed. I'm not sure I trust you. I hardly know you. His voice stayed calm. I understand your hesitation, but the more information I have, the better our chances of uncovering the truth. If there's a secret tying our families together, neither of us benefits from leaving it buried. She nodded, feeling the weight of her decision. I'll think about it. Alessandro picked up the photograph, slipping it back into his coat pocket. I appreciate you giving me a chance to explain. If you change your mind, call me. With that, he rose from the table, leaving her alone with the echo of unanswered questions. Emily stared at the ring on her hand, its emerald reflecting the overhead light. She felt torn between suspicion and longing, uncertain whether delving deeper would grant her the clarity she sought, or pull her further into a story she was never meant to know. Alessandro's footsteps faded, and the coffee shop buzzed around her. She wanted to stand up, walk away, and forget everything. But the letter in her purse and the ring on her finger demanded she face the past, even if it led her into unknown territory. Emily returned home from the coffee shop, her thoughts spinning. She told Alessandro she needed time to think, but her mind refused to rest. Slipping off her coat, she laid out the letter on her kitchen counter, studying each sentence she'd managed to translate. The handwritten lines spoke of a complicated relationship, a vow to keep secrets, and a warning about danger that once loomed over two people named Luca and Elena. She grabbed her phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard, torn between caution and urgency. A single thought drove her forward. She had to protect Sophie from any fallout. If the past was creeping into their present, she wanted control over how it would unfold. Finally, she tapped out a message to Alessandro. I have photos of the letter's text. Where should I send them? His reply came minutes later. Send them to this private address. I'll keep your trust. Hesitating only briefly, Emily attached the photos. She pressed send, wondering if this act would change everything. She tried to distract herself by starting dinner for Sophie, but the ping of her phone almost made her drop the pan. Alessandro had responded. Got it. I'll need a day or two to cross-reference. Meanwhile, stay alert. We're dealing with a piece of history many tried to bury. Stay alert. The phrase unsettled her. She shoved the phone aside, focusing instead on chopping vegetables. When Sophie came home from her after-school program, Emily forced a cheery grin. But the look in Sophie's eyes said she wasn't fooled. Mom, everything okay? Sophie asked, sliding her backpack onto a chair. Of course, sweetie. Emily turned back to the cutting board, wishing she felt as confident as her words sounded. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Instead, she read and reread the letter, practicing translations until the words blurred together. One line stood out in particular, something about the ring passing between families like a torch. Unable to make sense of it, she considered texting Alessandro again, but decided against it. The next morning, an email notification popped up from Alessandro with the subject line, Preliminary Findings. Emily's chest tightened. She opened the email, bracing for what she might discover. Inside, Alessandro explained that he'd identified references in older DiMartino estate documents. Names resembling Elena and Margaret appeared in scattered notes, but nothing conclusive. However, there was a detail he found compelling. Mention of a second ring, an exact match to the one in the DiMartino records. Emily swallowed. There it was, spelled out in digital text. Confirmation that two identical emerald rings existed, both rumored to carry significance beyond mere aesthetics. One ring apparently remained with the DiMartino family. The other vanished under circumstances never resolved. Alessandro ended his message with a brief directive. We need more context. I'm scheduled to fly to Italy next week. If you can join me, we might find answers in the original estate ledgers. Think about it. No pressure. No pressure, she repeated sarcastically in her head. He was inviting her to cross an ocean in pursuit of a decades-old secret. She stared at the screen, heart pounding with indecision. Was it insane to even consider it? She had a job and a daughter who needed stability, not international intrigue. But the ring on her finger weighed heavily. a constant reminder that her mother's life had contained chapters Emily knew nothing about. She picked Sophie up from school later that day, noticing how restless her daughter seemed. When they arrived home, Sophie finally blurted, "We barely talk anymore, Mom. You're always distracted." Emily bent down, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I'm sorry, honey. Something important came up about Grandma's past." Sophie's eyes flicked to the ring. "Is it about that fancy ring? The man in New York said it was special, right?" Emily considered how much to reveal. "Yes. It belonged to someone in his family, too. He thinks there's a story behind it." Sophie's face lit with curiosity. "That's so cool. Are we going on a treasure hunt or something?" Emily forced a laugh. "Not exactly a treasure hunt. More like learning where we come from." She left it at that, hesitant to involve Sophie any deeper. Yet after dinner, as Sophie did her homework, Emily found herself imagining what a trip to Italy might uncover. If the original ledgers existed, they could prove Margaret and Elena were the same woman, or at least confirm how the ring ended up in Emily's possession. The thought of traveling with Alessandro made her uneasy, but ignoring the truth felt worse. For the next few days, she busied herself at work, trying to maintain her routine. In spare moments, she read articles about the DiMartino family, each snippet raising more questions than answers. Their history stretched back centuries, marked by estates, patronage of the arts, and periodic scandals. Nothing directly referenced her mother. Still, the subtle clues pointed to an undercurrent of secrets well guarded by each generation. Late one evening, as she tucked Sophie into bed, her phone buzzed. It was Alessandro again, this time calling. Emily stepped into the living room, answering in a hushed tone. "Are you coming?" he asked without preamble. Emily closed her eyes. "I can't just drop everything. I have responsibilities." He didn't argue. "I respect that, but we might be at a pivotal moment. The records could be moved or lost if the estate is reorganized. My relatives are discussing selling part of the property. Once that happens, old documents could vanish." She chewed her lip, torn between fear and curiosity. "I need some time." "You have it," he said softly, "but not much. Let me know within 2 days." When the call ended, Emily stood by the darkened window, heart hammering. She thought of all the risks. Traveling to a foreign country with someone she barely trusted, leaving behind her job and her daughter's routine. On the other hand, this might be her only shot at uncovering the truth about her mother, and by extension, herself. Sophie's gentle snores drifted down the hallway, reminding Emily that whatever decision she made would affect them both. She stared at the ring, feeling its cool metal against her skin. Part of her wanted to lock it away, forget Alessandro, and move on. But the deeper pull of unanswered questions refused to let go. She knew, with growing certainty, that some journeys couldn't be avoided. Emily stood in her cramped living room, staring at her phone as if it were some elusive key. She knew she couldn't ignore Alessandro's invitation much longer. He'd given her 2 days to decide, and those days were almost gone. A trip to Italy. What would that even look like? She had a job, a daughter, and no clear idea whether the payoff would be worth the upheaval. She paced back and forth, her mind juggling practical worries and a craving for clarity. Eventually, she placed a call to her boss, a level-headed woman named Natalie who had been supportive through various personal challenges. Emily explained she needed personal leave, kept the details vague, and promised to work remotely if necessary. Natalie sounded concerned but granted the request, stressing that Emily should handle whatever was going on and come back focused. Relieved that at least her employment was secure for the moment, Emily set down the phone, feeling both lighter and more anxious. That evening, she tried to talk to Sophie in the gentlest way possible. They sat in the living room, the lights dimmed. Sophie was on the floor, coloring in a sketchbook, humming a tune under her breath. Emily cleared her throat softly. "Sweetie," she began, "what would you think if we went on a short trip?" Sophie paused, purple crayon hovering over the paper. "Where to?" "Maybe Italy," Emily answered, forcing her tone to remain casual. "It would be kind of last minute, but it might give us a chance to see some interesting places." Sophie's face lit up, the immediate sparkle in her eyes revealing excitement. "Really? Are we going to visit the Leaning Tower of Pisa and eat pizza in Italy?" That's so cool. Emily mustered a faint smile. She hated withholding the full truth, but she wasn't ready to explain the emotional implications of this trip. We might do that, or something close. It won't be a long vacation, though. More like a family history project. Sophie shrugged, still thrilled at the prospect of an adventure. That's okay. I can always do my homework online. Can we go, Mom? Please. Emily smoothed a hand over her daughter's hair. We'll see. I just need to confirm a few things. By the time Sophie went to bed, Emily felt marginally better. At least her daughter's enthusiasm softened some of her worries. The next step was to contact Alessandro. She glanced at her phone, running scenarios through her head. What if the trip revealed nothing? What if it uncovered more than she could handle? Steadying herself, she dialed his number. Alessandro picked up on the second ring. Emily, he greeted, sounding more patient than she'd expected. I'll do it, she said quickly, not wanting to lose her nerve. I'll come to Italy. She could almost sense his relief on the other end. We'll figure out logistics. I can make arrangements for lodging near the estate. You won't be obliged to stay with me, of course. As for airfare, I'll pay my own way, she cut in. Part of her bristled at the idea of relying on him financially. But I appreciate your help with accommodations. They agreed on a tentative timeline. Emily insisted Sophie come along. She refused to leave her behind in Boston, especially if the trip stretched longer than a few days. Alessandro hesitated, but eventually agreed, noting that the estate likely had enough space to accommodate them both. He promised to handle the details discreetly, reminding her that some family members might not be eager to revisit old scandals. After the call ended, Emily sank into her couch, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The plan felt unreal. She had never been one for spontaneity, always priding herself on a structured life. Limited resources meant she had to be practical. Now she was about to dive into the unknown, fueled by a sense of duty to her family's hidden narrative. The next day passed in a blur. She notified Sophie's teacher about the upcoming absence, explaining it as a short family trip. She reassured her boss she'd take her laptop to handle any urgent tasks. Nighttime found her printing out flight options, scanning for reasonable fares, and finalizing her itinerary. She nearly forgot about dinner until Sophie poked her head into the living room, yawning dramatically. "Mom, I'm hungry," the girl announced. They ended up ordering takeout, sharing a box of pizza on the couch while discussing what to pack. On the third day, Emily and Sophie found themselves in a taxi to the airport. A flutter of nerves danced in Emily's stomach, but she tried to keep her expression calm for Sophie's sake. Her daughter, meanwhile, practically bounced in her seat, eyes glued to the passing lights. Once inside the terminal, Emily managed the check-in process, her thoughts a wild mix of excitement and apprehension. Alessandro had texted that he'd fly separately and meet them at the arrivals hall in Florence. Holding onto Sophie's hand, Emily silently prayed this journey wouldn't leave them with more questions than answers. Hours of flight time passed, neither restful nor pleasant. Sophie dozed off intermittently, her head resting on Emily's shoulder. Emily attempted to read the letter again, but the airplane's dim lighting and the press of her own unease made the words blur together. She tucked the pages away, mentally preparing for whatever the DiMartino estate might reveal. When they finally landed, she guided a groggy Sophie through customs, the pace feeling slower than it should. They collected their luggage and emerged into the arrivals area. Alessandro stood at the edge of the crowd, scanning faces. As soon as their eyes met, he gave a reserved nod, stepping forward to greet them. Sophie hid shyly behind Emily, unsure how to respond to this near stranger. "Welcome to Italy," he said quietly, offering a polite smile. His gaze flickered to Sophie. "I have a car waiting outside." Emily nodded, absorbing the atmosphere of unfamiliar voices and announcements echoing through the terminal. She took Sophie's hand and followed Alessandro toward the exit, feeling the weight of her decision settle in. Here they were, far from home, relying on someone she'd met under uneasy circumstances, all for the chance to unearth a secret that had shaped her life without her knowledge. As they stepped into the cool Italian air, Emily clung to a single hope, that whatever they discovered at the DiMartino estate would bring more answers than regrets. They piled into the waiting sedan, and as the driver pulled into traffic, Emily couldn't help wondering what hidden truths awaited them on the road ahead. The drive from the airport led past gently rolling hills, hints of olive groves, and stretches of farmland. Emily found herself staring out the window, trying to absorb the new landscape while keeping one eye on Sophie, who was nodding off in the back seat. Alessandro sat beside the driver, offering the occasional observation about the region, though he kept his voice low. Every now and then, Emily caught fragments of his conversation, which sounded more like instructions than casual commentary. After nearly an hour, the sedan turned onto a narrow, tree-lined road that wound through tall cypress trees. At the end of the lane stood an imposing iron gate. Alessandro tapped a code into a small panel, and the gate slowly swung open. As they passed through, Emily's heart thumped. A large, old-world estate, its faded limestone walls climbing 3 stories, came into view. Despite any lingering doubts, she had to admit the place carried a certain quiet grandeur. They pulled up to a courtyard framed by climbing ivy, where a middle-aged woman in a crisp shirt and tailored trousers stepped out to greet them. Alessandro introduced her as Isabella, a trusted house manager who'd prepared rooms for Emily and Sophie. Isabella offered a polite smile and beckoned them inside. The interior was no less impressive. High ceilings, polished floors, and framed portraits gave the space a stately feel. Sophie gripped Emily's hand, her wide eyes darting around. Emily couldn't blame her. It was overwhelming. Despite the house's elegance, something in the air hinted at secrets and tensions hidden behind polished doors. Alessandro led them down a corridor to a suite with 2 adjoining rooms. "Make yourselves at home," he said simply. "We'll talk once you're settled." Emily nodded, stepping into the first room. It was generously furnished, but not ostentatious. She ushered Sophie into the second room, relieved to see a cozy bed and a small desk by the window. "This is really fancy," Sophie whispered, her voice reverent. With a tired smile, Emily set down their luggage. "We won't be here long," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "Let's unpack a bit, then we'll see what Alessandro wants to discuss." Sophie wandered over to the window, gazing out at a manicured garden below. "I like this place," she murmured, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "It feels like a storybook." Emily patted her shoulder. "Try to rest for a moment. This has been a long journey." She returned to the main room, where Alessandro was waiting, his posture indicating restrained impatience. "Let's talk downstairs," he suggested. Isabella prepared a light lunch in the study. They made their way through the corridor, passing portraits of serious-looking men and women from eras gone by. In the study, an antique table was set with fresh bread, cheese, and a carafe of water. Emily took a seat, wary but hungry enough to appreciate the spread. Alessandro poured water into 2 glasses, then sat opposite her. "We don't have a lot of time," he began, glancing toward the door as if ensuring no one else was listening. "I've reached out to the caretaker of our archival records, a man named Giancarlo. He's agreed to open the estate's private collection to us tomorrow morning. Usually, that requires a formal request from a family elder, but I convinced him it was urgent." Emily picked at a piece of bread. "I appreciate your effort. Does he know what we're looking for?" "Only that it involves documents tied to Luca's departure, plus any records mentioning an Elena. He's aware I'm searching for missing family pieces, but I've been vague on purpose." She nodded, feeling a wave of tension build. "And what about the rest of your family? Won't they notice strangers walking around the house?" Alessandro hesitated. "My older brother, Marco, might arrive later this week. He's stayed out of the Di Martino estate's affairs for the past year, but he still carries influence. If he shows up, we'll have to handle the questions." "Handle them how?" He lowered his voice. "Discreetly. My family isn't fond of reviving old scandals. If we find undeniable proof of a connection, it might stir up problems." Emily swallowed, suddenly aware she was in the middle of a centuries-old legacy. "I'm not trying to claim any inheritance or cause a stir. I just want the truth." A faint smile crossed Alessandro's face. "We'll see how it unfolds. Sometimes the truth complicates everything." They finished the light meal in uneasy silence. Emily wanted to ask more about the estate, about Alessandro's relatives, about what might happen if her mother really was tied to Luca Di Martino. But the weight of jet lag tugged at her, and the house felt like it had ears. "Thank you for arranging this," she said finally, standing up. "I should check on Sophie. Tomorrow, we'll meet Giancarlo and see what he has." Alessandro gave a brief nod. "I'll walk you back to your room." They stepped into the hallway, the echo of their footsteps magnified by the high ceilings. As they passed a row of portraits, one painting in particular made Emily pause. It depicted a woman with a graceful tilt of her head, her dark eyes seeming to stare into the distance. Something about the angle of her jaw tugged at Emily's memory. "Who is she?" Emily asked quietly. Alessandro glanced at the portrait. "That's my grandmother, Viola Di Martino. She was known for commissioning custom jewelry, including the ring you carry." Emily pressed her lips together, absorbing the moment. She thought of the ring on her own finger, the connection it might share with the woman in the painting. Could she have known Margaret or Elena personally? Alessandro shifted slightly. "Perhaps you'll learn more about her in the archives." When they reached the suite, Alessandro excused himself, stating he had calls to make. Emily closed the door behind her, releasing a long breath. Sophie was sprawled on the bed, reading from a tablet. Emily walked over, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Everything okay, Mom?" Sophie asked, sensing her mother's unease. "It will be," Emily replied, trying to sound confident. She thought about the painting of Viola, the swirling questions about Luca, the letter that hinted at a life her mother had hidden. Yes, they were stepping into a world of unknowns, but the next step was already set. Tomorrow morning, she'd search the estate archives for whatever truth they held. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting the day's events sink in. Outside, a light breeze rustled the cypress trees. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed quietly. Emily shut her eyes, preparing herself for whatever awaited them in the estate's dusty records, and hoping this journey would shed light rather than cast deeper shadows. Early the next morning, Emily roused herself before dawn. Sleep had been fitful, and the anticipation of what they might discover weighed heavily on her mind. She nudged Sophie awake with gentle persistence, wanting to give them time to prepare without rushing. Sophie, still groggy, pulled on a sweater and followed her mother down the hallway to a small dining area where Isabella had set out a simple breakfast. Alessandro arrived moments later, looking alert despite the early hour. He offered a brief greeting, then motioned for Emily to join him by a side table. A cup of strong coffee was waiting for her there, its aroma comforting in the quiet atmosphere. "Giancarlo will meet us at the archives in 30 minutes, Alessandro said, voice hushed. "He prefers to start early, before the staff begins their daily routines. Fewer questions that way." Emily sipped the coffee, an underlying sense of unease flickering inside her. She glanced at Sophie, who was already nibbling on a slice of bread. The idea of exposing her daughter to family secrets felt unsettling, but she hadn't found a suitable arrangement to leave Sophie behind. Soon, Isabella appeared to escort Sophie on a brief tour of the gardens, promising to keep her occupied. Emily watched them head outside, grateful Sophie would have something pleasant to focus on. Once alone, Emily and Alessandro made their way through a labyrinth of corridors until they reached a heavy wooden door at the far end of the estate. Alessandro gave a discreet knock. After a pause, the door swung open, revealing a middle-aged man with thin, precise features and silver-framed glasses. "You must be Emily," he said in a measured tone, stepping aside to let them enter. "I'm Giancarlo." The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of aged paper. Rows of shelves lined the walls, filled with binders, leather-bound ledgers, and piles of loose documents. A few windows let in slivers of morning light, but the space remained dim, illuminated primarily by scattered lamps. Emily couldn't help feeling a slight chill, as though stepping into a vault of secrets. Giancarlo led them deeper into the room, pointing to a section of shelving that looked older than the rest. "These are the historical records referencing the Di Martino holdings, going back several generations. It's a fragmented collection, but you may find references to both Luca and any mention of Elena or Margaret." Emily inhaled, fortifying herself. "Thank you. Where should we start?" The archivist rubbed his chin. "I've pulled some items that might be useful," he said, gesturing to a table covered in folders. "This stack is from the mid-20th century. It includes personal letters, estate ledgers, and a few diaries. Proceed gently. Some documents are delicate." They settled in at the table, and Giancarlo returned to his desk to resume cataloging. Alessandro carefully lifted the top file, skimming through pages of handwritten notes. Emily did the same with a ledger, scanning names and dates. As the minutes passed, the rustling of paper and the tapping of footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. When Emily uncovered a small leather-bound journal marked with the initials LDM, her heart beat faster. Opening it, she found entries in Italian, dated more than half a century ago. She recognized a few references to the ring. The writing described a complicated situation involving two identical emerald pieces, one kept in a protective vault and another rumored lost. Her breath caught at a mention of a reunion in the Americas, though the journal stopped abruptly with no closure. Meanwhile, Alessandro pored over an envelope stuffed with correspondence. At one point, he set aside a letter, eyes narrowing. "Emily, look at this," he murmured, handing it to her. The letter was dated nearly 30 years ago, addressed to Signora Elena, but marked "Return to Sender." It contained a single paragraph describing a changed inheritance claim. The signature at the bottom read, "Viola Di Martino." Emily felt her pulse spike. So Viola personally wrote to this Elena, and the letter was never delivered. It implies she knew where Elena had gone, or at least tried to reach her. Alessandro pursed his lips. If Viola sent this letter, it suggests she acknowledged some connection. Yet there's no further explanation. They continued working through the stack, each new fragment hinting at a story that once lived in the shadows. Emily discovered a crumbling note that read, "Elena's departure can't remain secret forever. If the ring surfaces, the truth will follow." The handwriting was shaky, signed only with a cryptic L. Alessandro rubbed a hand over his chin, deep in thought. These scraps confirm a few things. Luca left with someone named Elena, they fled to the US, and at some point, my grandmother tried to re-establish contact. But we still don't have concrete proof of how your mother fits in. Emily pressed a hand to her forehead. If Elena was an alias, maybe my mother switched names to protect herself, or to hide from the Di Martino family. And maybe that's why I never heard of Luca. A sudden sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Giancarlo looked up, irritation flickering across his face. Another knock, more forceful this time. Alessandro shot Emily a warning glance, then crossed the room to open the door. Standing there was a tall figure with the stern bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Marco Di Martino, Alessandro's older brother. Marco's gaze swept over Alessandro, then shifted to Emily, the tension in his posture rising. "Care to explain why you're rummaging through the estate's private records?" Emily's stomach lurched. Her mind raced, trying to find a reasonable explanation. The air thickened with apprehension, and Giancarlo set aside his work, clearly uncomfortable with the intrusion. Alessandro maintained a neutral composure, stepping into the doorway as if to shield Emily from Marco's glare. "We're researching a matter that concerns both our families," Alessandro said carefully. "I meant to inform you, but I wasn't aware you'd be arriving today." Marco's eyes narrowed. "You can't keep secrets in this house, especially not about Luca or the rumors that nearly destroyed our name." Emily fought the urge to step back, unsettled by the force of his accusation. She managed to steady her voice, though each word felt like a risk. "I'm just looking for answers about my mother. She may have been involved with Luca, but I have no intention of causing trouble." Marco ignored her explanation. "Whatever you think you'll find here," he said, turning his full attention to Alessandro, "I suggest you stop. Our parents protected us from this scandal for a reason." Alessandro lifted his chin, voice calm but unyielding. "We have a right to know the truth." Marco's shoulders tensed. "Then expect consequences." The room fell silent. Emily stood by the table, heart pounding, while Giancarlo cast uneasy glances toward the door. In that charged moment, it became clear that the archives hid more than family records. They housed the threads of a story that some had no intention of letting surface. Alessandro's posture remained steady, though Emily could sense the tension coursing through him. Marco stood in the doorway to the archives, his expression an unsettling mix of anger and authority. Giancarlo kept a cautious distance, as if uncertain whether he should intervene. "You can't just barge in here and shut us down," Alessandro said, voice calm but firm. "We're not rummaging around for gossip. This is about understanding our family's past, and Emily's." Emily glanced at the table, where pages of letters lay spread out. She felt an urge to gather them, protect what little they'd uncovered. "My mother might be connected to Luca Di Martino," she said. "We're piecing together fragments that could explain how she ended up in the U.S. with this ring." "Spare me the sentiment," Marco interrupted, his gaze cold. "That scandal nearly tore our family apart. If my father hadn't intervened, we might have lost everything to rumors and half-truths." He turned to Alessandro. "We agreed never to revisit this." "You knew better." Alessandro's jaw tightened. "We never agreed on anything. I was a child when Luca disappeared, and no one told me the full story. You've clung to a family myth, that we should ignore what happened, keep the estate intact, and pretend we're free of secrets. But ignoring something doesn't make it vanish." Marco's nostrils flared. "And this is your solution? Bringing strangers into our home? Exposing us to potential extortion or legal claims?" Emily's cheeks burned. "I'm not here for money. I don't want a piece of your estate. I only want to know my mother's story. If it ties back to your family, that's not my fault." For a moment, Marco said nothing. His eyes flickered to Giancarlo, who was now standing behind his desk, clutching a folder to his chest as though bracing for fallout. Finally, Marco exhaled. "You're too naive, Ms. Miller. You have no idea what you're stepping into." Alessandro moved between them, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Stop threatening her. If we find evidence that clarifies the truth about Luca and Elena, it's better for everyone. Let's end the rumors and lies." Marco's glare shifted to the documents on the table. With a swift motion, he snatched up one of the letters. Emily's heart skipped a beat, afraid he'd destroy it, but he only glanced over the writing before tossing it aside. "Do you even know how deep this runs?" he demanded. "Our grandfather went to great lengths to protect the Di Martino name. If you force old wounds open, you'll drag our entire history through the mud." Alessandro remained unmoved. Sometimes old wounds need airing before they can heal. A tense silence followed. Emily found herself gripped by both fear and frustration. She didn't want to be here, locked in a power struggle with a man who had every reason to guard his family's secrets. But she couldn't back down now, not when she was so close to understanding a part of her mother's life that had been hidden for decades. Eventually, Marco tossed the letter onto the table. "Do what you must," he said grudgingly, "but don't expect me to bail you out when things go wrong." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and stalked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded completely. The tension in the room lingered like a charged current. Giancarlo broke the silence, clearing his throat. "I should return to my duties," he said quietly, edging toward the door. "If you need anything else, let me know." As the archivist left, Alessandro released a long breath, leaning on the table. "I knew Marco would be upset, but I hoped we'd have more time before he showed up." Emily busied herself, gathering the scattered letters and setting them neatly in a folder. Her hands trembled slightly. What did he mean by consequences? Is he going to try to stop us? Alessandro shrugged. He might cause delays, shut us out of certain rooms, or spread rumors among other relatives to turn them against us. He values the Di Martino reputation and believes any scandal will hurt our standing, even if it's from decades ago. Emily swallowed hard. "I just want to make sure Sophie and I aren't caught in the crossfire." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I won't let anything happen to you or Sophie." Marco barks, but he rarely bites. He's more about intimidation than action. His words offered some relief, but Emily still felt uneasy. She thought of Sophie wandering the garden with Isabella, blissfully unaware of the confrontation that had just taken place. "We have a few more documents to review," she said, her voice faintly shaky. "Then I need to check on my daughter." Alessandro reached for another folder. "Agreed. Let's see if there's anything else here that can clarify who Elena was." and how she became your mother. They worked in subdued focus for the next hour. Emily scanned pages of property inventories and receipts, searching for any mention of Elena or Margaret that might confirm a link. Alessandro flipped through more letters, setting aside ones that looked potentially useful. Despite the earlier confrontation, the estate remained quiet, and no one else interrupted them. Emily finally discovered a slip of paper tucked inside an old ledger. It listed 3 precious items stored in a private vault: 2 emerald rings and a diamond brooch. Next to one ring, a handwritten note read, "Gifted to L." Underneath, in lighter ink, someone had added, "Gone to America?" Emily's pulse quickened. This slip validated the idea that a Di Martino heirloom had indeed left Italy, presumably with Luca. She nudged Alessandro, who studied it closely. "L for Luca," he mused. "And a question mark about going to America. That's our missing piece right there." Emboldened by the find, Emily sifted through more pages, hoping for a direct mention of Elena. Most were frustratingly vague, small hints but never the full story. Finally, she couldn't ignore her fatigue or the worry creeping in about Sophie. "We should wrap up for now," she said. "We can't solve everything in one sitting." Alessandro nodded in agreement, carefully sliding the slip of paper into a protective sleeve. "We'll keep this in a safe place," he said, tucking it into a folder. "Let's see how we can verify these references. There might be someone in town who recalls bits of local lore, or who had contact with Luca before he left." The two of them exchanged a look, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was only the beginning of a larger confrontation. The estate held more than dusty documents. It bristled with family tensions, unspoken pacts, and the looming possibility that Marco could intervene again. Stepping out of the archive room, Emily drew a calming breath. The hallway felt strangely peaceful after the charged atmosphere inside. She glanced down the corridor, relieved not to see Marco waiting in ambush. Together, she and Alessandro began making their way back, each step echoing in the silence. Once they reached the courtyard, Emily spotted Sophie and Isabella near a fountain. Sophie ran up, her eyes bright. "Mom, you should see the garden. There's a maze and I almost got lost, but Isabella showed me the way out." Emily bent to hug her daughter. "That sounds amazing," she said softly, though her mind still buzzed with the chaos of the morning. Stealing a glance at Alessandro, she saw a flicker of determination cross his face. They would continue digging, no matter how hard Marco fought them. And somewhere in the dusty ledgers and half-faded letters, she hoped, lay the truth that would finally reveal her mother's secret life. That afternoon, a sense of unease gripped Emily as she escorted Sophie back inside. They had spent the rest of the morning exploring the estate's manicured grounds, hoping the open air might ease the tension. Yet the memory of Marco's hostile intrusion lingered. Sophie, blissfully unaware of the family feud unfolding, chattered about hedges and fountains, while Emily struggled to focus on casual conversation. Isabella appeared in the doorway, her expression a careful mask of politeness. "Lunch will be served in 30 minutes. Mr. Alessandro is making some calls in the library," she announced, gesturing down the hall. "You and Miss Sophie are welcome to wait in the sitting room, if you prefer." Emily thanked her, leading Sophie to a cozy alcove with plush chairs and tall windows that overlooked a side garden. She tried to read a children's book aloud, but her thoughts kept drifting. At last, Alessandro's footsteps echoed in the hallway. He entered, looking tired but resolute. "I've spoken with a few distant relatives," he said quietly, inclining his head toward Emily. "No one admits to knowing more than we already do. Everyone's aware of Marco's stance, though. He's trying to convince people we're stirring up unnecessary trouble." Emily pursed her lips. "No surprise. How long do you think we have before he escalates things?" Alessandro sighed. "I'm not sure. He'll try to block access to anything he can, but the archives are under my purview as well. Officially, we're both heirs, so I have equal rights to them. That won't stop him from making this personal, though." Sophie peered up from her seat, sensing the gravity in their tones. "Mom, are you still looking for Grandma's story?" she asked softly. Emily nodded, trying to maintain a reassuring smile. "Yes, honey. It might take some time." Alessandro's gaze flickered to Sophie. I'm sorry you have to see the estate under these circumstances, he said kindly. It's not usually so tense. Emily cleared her throat. Let's focus on the lead we found. Gone to America? The slip implying Luca left with an emerald ring. Before Alessandro could respond, Isabella entered, giving them a polite nod. Lunch is ready in the main dining room. Shall I escort you there? They followed her through another series of corridors, eventually emerging into a spacious dining area with high windows. A long table was set with a modest yet elegant meal. Part of Emily expected more grandeur, fancy centerpieces, crystal chandeliers, but perhaps that was reserved for grander events. Here, it felt almost subdued, as though the house itself sensed the strain among its inhabitants. As they sat, Alessandro surveyed the place settings. Where's Marco? Isabella kept her composure. He declined to join you. He said he'd be dining in his study. Sophie frowned in confusion. Emily reached for her daughter's hand under the table, giving it a light squeeze. She wasn't thrilled at the thought of them all dining together, but Marco's absence served as a reminder that his opposition was growing. They ate quietly, the clang of cutlery amplifying the silence. Emily's mind drifted to the dusty ledger pages and the note referencing the ring. If L stood for Luca, then it was clear the ring left the estate decades ago, presumably with someone named Elena. Now, that ring rested on Emily's finger, raising a swirl of questions that only Luca or Elena could answer. But both had long vanished. After lunch, Alessandro suggested they step into a smaller study near the library. Once inside, he closed the door, keeping his voice low. I want to search the old vault. It's mostly ceremonial now, but some personal items remain locked away. We might find something overlooked in the main archive. Emily eyed him uncertainly. And how exactly do we access it? Will Marco try to stop us again? A wry smile tugged at Alessandro's lips. The vault sits in a private wing. We both share rights to it as heirs. Marco can't legally bar me from entering. The real question is whether he'll notice before we finish looking. Sophie shifted on her feet. Sounds like a treasure hunt, she said with quiet excitement, though Emily could see a flicker of worry beneath her daughter's enthusiasm. Emily knelt beside Sophie. I need you to stay close if we do this, okay? It's not a game. There could be fragile or important items in that vault. Sophie nodded earnestly. I understand. A plan formed quickly. Late in the afternoon, when the household staff typically changed shifts and the corridors were less monitored, Alessandro would unlock the vault. Emily would help search, while Sophie remained at their side, a silent participant. They hoped to move quickly and quietly, avoiding any confrontation with Marco. Time crawled until the appointed hour. The three of them slipped out of their rooms, walking briskly through lesser-used passageways until they reached a heavy wooden door at the end of a dim corridor. Alessandro produced a key from his pocket, inserted it into the lock, and turned. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Sophie clung to Emily's hand as they carefully navigated the steps. At the bottom, they came upon another locked door. Alessandro felt along the wall for a switch, finally flipping on a single overhead bulb that bathed the room in weak light. The small chamber beyond was lined with metal drawers, each labeled with faded lettering. A larger safe stood against the far wall, its surface showing signs of age. Alessandro approached it, consulting a slip of paper on which he'd scribbled the combination. He input the numbers, turned the handle, and exhaled in relief when the heavy door clicked open. Inside lay a scattering of velvet boxes, old documents, and a tarnished silver container. Emily's pulse quickened. This was the Di Martino vault, where presumably one of the two original emerald rings had once been stored. She picked up a small wooden box, blowing away dust that clung to its surface. Beneath the grime, she could make out the initials VDM for Viola Di Martino. Alessandro peered over her shoulder. Check inside, he urged, voice hushed. With careful hands, Emily lifted the lid. Her heart leapt at the sight of a single emerald ring nestled in worn velvet. It bore an uncanny resemblance to the ring she wore, though this one had a slightly different band design. She cradled it, comparing it to her own. They were unmistakably twins. Sophie, wide-eyed, hovered nearby. Mom, It's just like yours, she whispered. Emily nodded, her breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Alessandro, who met her gaze with a mixture of triumph and apprehension. They had found the estate's matching ring, proof, beyond any doubt, that the piece Emily inherited was indeed part of the same set. But as she turned the ring over in her hand, Emily spotted a small, engraved numeral on the inner band, perhaps a serial or family mark. She wondered if the ring back in Boston carried the same marking, hidden under years of wear. If so, this discovery would tie her mother directly to the DiMartino lineage. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps above made them all freeze. Someone was moving along the corridor overhead. Sophie's eyes went wide, and Alessandro raised a hand, motioning for silence. They waited, every second dragging like an eternity, unsure whether Marco or someone else was about to catch them in the act. In that tense moment, Emily tightened her hold on the ring, bracing for the possibility that their secret search was about to be exposed. The question wasn't just if they'd be discovered. It was also how far Marco would go to keep the past buried. The footsteps above grew louder, then paused. Emily held her breath, the emerald ring pressing into her palm. Alessandro motioned for Sophie to stay still, and they listened in tense silence. Time stretched, each second a question of whether they'd be discovered. Finally, the footsteps faded, leaving only the distant echo of creaking floorboards. "We should leave," Alessandro whispered. Gently, he slipped the newly found ring back into its box. Emily's heart hammered as she set the container in place, quietly shutting the vault door. They tiptoed up the narrow staircase, anxious to exit before anyone returned. At the top, Alessandro locked the door behind them. Emily clutched Sophie's hand, relief mingling with a fresh surge of fear. Their secret foray had uncovered definitive proof linking her mother's ring to the DiMartino set, yet the threat of Marco, and whatever else lay hidden in this estate, still loomed. They fled down a dim corridor, determined not to let their discovery become fuel for another confrontation. Outside, a cool breeze greeted them, but Emily's nerves refused to settle. The truth was growing, and so were the consequences. The next morning, Emily paced the suite, torn between urgency and caution. She had proof the two rings were a matched set, yet doubts gnawed at her. What if Marco discovered they'd accessed the vault? Sophie watched her mother with concern, while Alessandro quietly gathered notes and copies of the archive slips. A sudden knock made them freeze. Alessandro opened the door to find Marco standing there, expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside uninvited. His gaze flicked to the papers spread across a small desk. "So, it's true," Marco muttered, lifting a page. "You're determined to drag our family's past into the light." Emily squared her shoulders. "I just want to know about my mother. I'm not aiming to ruin anyone." Marco exhaled, his tone steely. "You've gone too far already. Either stop digging or leave this estate." Sophie clutched Emily's hand, eyes wide. Alessandro spoke up, voice calm but resolute. "We won't be bullied into silence." Marco's jaw tightened. "Then prepare for whatever follows." 3 days later, with tensions at a breaking point, Emily decided to confront everything head-on. She invited Marco, Alessandro, and a couple of other DiMartino relatives to gather in the estate's library. Sophie sat quietly by her mother's side, clutching the ring Emily had worn for so long. Standing before them all, Emily opened a folder containing the documents they'd uncovered. The slip showing "Gone to America," the letter referencing Elena's secret identity, and photos comparing the two emerald rings. She spoke plainly, explaining how her mother, once Margaret, possibly Elena, had fled Italy with Luca to protect a forbidden bond that challenged DiMartino tradition. Emily's voice shook with emotion as she described how their fear of scandal had reverberated through generations, robbing her of a chance to know her true heritage. Marco listened, arms crossed in defiance, but his gaze softened as Emily placed the folder on a nearby table. She offered no demands for money or claims on property, only a plea for acceptance of the truth. Slowly, Marco's anger ebbed. He glanced at Alessandro, who nodded in silent agreement. Whatever shame he'd carried dissolved under the weight of Emily's sincerity. In the end, they reached an uneasy accord. The DiMartino family would acknowledge Margaret, once Elena, as part of their lineage, and Emily would keep both rings as symbols of reconciliation rather than contention. Marco agreed to update the estate records, ensuring Emily and Sophie's names appeared in the family history. Although the past still stung, the act of transparency felt like a step toward peace. On their final day at the estate, Emily and Sophie walked through the garden maze one last time. Sunlight filtered through tall hedges, and the tension that once clung to the house lifted, replaced by cautious hope. Alessandro caught up with them near the fountain, handing Emily a small, leather-bound diary they'd found in the vault, Luca's journal. Inside, Luca's final entry thanked Elena for her courage and the love that transcended old loyalties. "Thank you," Emily whispered, clutching the diary. She understood now that her mother's true legacy wasn't hidden in shame, but guarded by love and sacrifice. With quiet relief, Emily and Sophie left for the airport, the emerald ring and Luca's journal tucked safely in her bag. Though the DiMartino estate stood behind them, the bond it represented, family roots, once severed and now reconnected, would guide Emily into a future where truth meant more than any secret could ever overshadow.